everyone, and thank you for joining today on our webinar. My name is Jim Nelson, and I'll be talking to you today about managing risk in and around a critical environment. We're excited about the session and the content. There's a lot of materials, and we thank you again for joining and making time in your busy schedule. There's some information about me and contact, etc. on the screen. And I apologize for the picture, so hopefully I can bring some subject matter expertise versus good looks. So in our webinar objectives today, we're going to look at three major items. Understanding the risks and types of potential risks that may affect a critical environment. And we're going to take a look at a few case studies and some information and some research that's been done and see what we can learn and pick up a few points from. And finally, we'll understand the different causes of outages and potentially how to avoid those. And I'm being assisted today by Tiffany. And if you have questions as we go through, use the question buttons and we'll try and address those. And we also have some polling that will go on place to ask some information at this point. So your first poll question. And we'll give a few moments for you folks to take a choice and look at a few different items there on the polls.
And thanks, Jim, for the introduction. Once again, that first poll is, which of the following best describes your current job? And so far, we have 85% of our attendees reporting in. And we'll go ahead and close that poll here.
Thank you, Tiffany. So it looks like we've got a nice blend, about half the folks working around business continuity and risk. Another, about a quarter, work in a critical environment in and around. And a smaller percentage are working in IT or technology. So thank you for sharing that. And we have some miscellaneous.
Great. We're all set.
Okay, one of the challenges that we all face, as you're probably very well aware if you live in this environment, is we're moving to an age and adopting and becoming more mature and going to, quote, the cloud. And there's more pressures on not only business, but all organizations, including government organizations, to have higher availability and also to have a secure environment to operate in. And we're also looking at minimizing environmental impacts. I'm sure most of you encountered things like green computing, LEED around your data center, green building, etc. So we're trying to be environmentally sensitive and responsible. And more we're seeing to accomplish this, that organizations that are informed are using standards as a guideline to adhere and become compliant, and in some cases seek to be aligned or even certified. What is that driving towards? Just in a short period of years, we're hitting the point where we need immediate availability. So customers expect zero downtime. When they want to use a system, they want it available. But that's fraught with many risks. Today, we are specifically not going to talk about every risk that could occur, whether that's severe weather or cyber attacks or lions and tigers and bears or hurricane events that we're experiencing in tropical storms. today we're going to kind of focus that on the critical environment. And the rationale being, it is a critical environment. There should be some thought and concept that has been put into this facility or multiple facilities to harden and protect that. Still, you remain, because in a critical environment, you have quite a bit of technical infrastructure, and it becomes complex systems. So you folks that work in and around data centers or audit or in the facilities or the engineering side recognize we have complex mechanical systems around a critical environment, including electrical systems and primaries and backup that range in between alternate pathing and having UPS and batteries and generators and lots of different technology. We're also concerned about fire and life safety, so we don't burn the building to the ground, and there's constant infrastructure risks there, or we don't compromise our staff and occupants. Then we also have building automation. Our critical environments are becoming so complex that we can no longer manually manage that. So we have building automation and controls and desyn throughout the system when we're using more automation. We also need to be watching our systems, our applications, our availability, our network. In addition to that, we have structural concerns about the strength and integrity of the building to not only operate in a business as usual, but if there are risks that put additional pressures on those from those external or natural resources, whether that's severe weather, high winds, or seismic activity. We also have water and plumbing control throughout the critical environment. In addition, we're all challenged with access control. How do we protect and allow the appropriate people that have a need to operate inside that data center or critical environment? And then there's physical security that is becoming more and more involved, and of course, cybersecurity. In addition to that, we have some administrative risks. And I'm going to move through this rather quickly, but what does this talk to? I'd summarize this to say, it is the unique culture of your organization. What do they allow you and encourage you to do in your operational practices? What are you encouraged and allowed to do for your predictive maintenance, your preventative maintenance? Are there budget constraints? Are you always fighting to get additional funding for staff and projects? That also ties in, that we'll talk about a little bit later, about the culture and the organization you work for or who you support. What is their risk appetite? What is their risk accepting? How much risk are they willing to bear? So having a cultural understanding about how things are done in your organization or the organization you support. Of course, there's always other priorities, other business imperatives and priorities, and we need to be looking at being able to get systems back from disaster or operational outages in a meaningful and effective time frame. Then you're also challenged with having legacy systems. I do have the opportunity to move in and out of many data centers during the year, and I realize most organizations face all of these challenges, and many organizations are dealing with legacy systems along with trying to move to the new technologies. Then you have your backups, whether you're doing them physically or whether you're doing some kind of replication technology and electronic backups. And that gets your data managed, and that's a whole different presentation. And then, in addition, the other administrative roles are protecting your assets and having asset lists up to date, having your applications known so they can operate with your data, and your systems operate as designed. So there's many administrative risks. We'll touch just a little bit on environmental risk and talk about natural disasters. This is put in just because of some of the timing that's occurring, especially here in the U.S. currently with some weather. And this is a study that has been done looking at a number of natural disasters by region on the left-hand side as you're looking at your screen. And then on the right-hand side is the impacts and the amount of damages that come as a result of these events. We're going to spend some specific time today on human-caused risks, because we do have potentially some control on our people. And when you look at this citing in this research done by the U.S. Department of Energy, events, a very large percentage are related to human errors or mistakes. And then as you follow that, the events on the left to the right-hand side, also a very large percentages are due to some kind of organizational weakness. And we'll talk about that a little bit throughout the session, whether that's an MOP, a method of procedures, having standard operating procedures, emergency operating procedures, how good your documentation is, and how strong your staffing is. People make mistakes, but we see in the pie chart that individual mistakes are a smaller percentage. Then we also have location-based risk. This, just going through, in the circle there, this is a critical location. It's a prime data center, and you can see it's located near water, quite close. And this is done a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is how do you go about doing your location-based risk? You want to minimize risk, not add risk. So in this case, there are some challenges of some problems that could occur based upon the location that was selected at some point in the past. So we have another quick poll here, and I'll hand it to Tiffany on this one.
So our next poll is, which of the following types of risk causes you the most concern? Great information so far, Jim. We have about 80% of our attendees reporting in.
Perfect.
We'll go ahead and close the poll now.
Thank you for that. And just a quick couple of comments, and I think you can all see the results a little bit, is about a third are infrastructure risks that we just talked about. A little bit more than that, 40% are human-caused risks. To a lesser degree are those location risks, and I do understand that. My only comment on location-based, and we'll talk about that later. Many of you inherited a situation or a critical environment where someone else in your organization was responsible for the original design, engineering, and intent in picking that location. Then as time passed on, you've come on and you're expected to keep high availability and manage risk. There's some things that you can do, but there are some other things and strategies that are not able to be resolved quickly and within your budget authority. In addition to that, we have some other contributing factors. Going and building upon that thought, maybe you have a well-designed systems, okay, but how is it being operated, and that changes over time. Okay. Then there's also contributing factors, that are issues that are related and maybe compound your risk situation. Then there's external or outside influences, things that you have limited control on, and that might be weather, or in this case, instability or problems with the power grid or severe situations. Then we have other issues, and this goes to what we were talking about, culture. What items do you have at end of life or age related? Most of the components in a critical environment were designed with a specific life expectancy. Sometimes that's overlooked as time goes on and equipment ages. and you continue to operate it beyond its expected life. And that also applies to technical equipment that is no longer supported, and licensing and software, etc. Other contributing factors I'd mentioned a few minutes ago, that you may have inherited a data center, and then over time, as that aging infrastructure changes, you're going to develop gaps between what was the best efforts at that time and what has evolved in the industry or the profession or as good practices. So staying current with that is a challenge. And over time, you expand and widen that gap with the result that your risk changes. One example of that are regulatory changes. So for you folks that are maybe on the facility support side, you're probably aware that there are new electrical codes that are reviewed and issued on a regular basis. And these impact how you would operate and maintain and what is expected from your infrastructure. Okay. Now we're talking about risk. A lot of that risk gets into, as we talked about, your customers, your management, your clients, your staff expect high availability. When you have an outage or you're not highly availability, there's problems related. So I'm going to highlight a few things. A gentleman named Larry Ponyman runs the Ponyman Institute out of Michigan, and he's done some nice research that is industry funded over time. And the research on data center outages basically is revisited in 2016, which this includes, and 3 years previous, 2013, and back in 2010. So as part of their analysis, they've come up with the structure, and I'll show you a graphic in a couple of slides. So what kind of costs or impacts are involved with an outage? First off, early detection. How do you discover and detect, and what activities need to occur to understand what exactly happened or what is currently happening? Then in addition, they've identified some containment costs. Those are really activities and efforts that are associated with stabilizing it and causing it not to deteriorate further. In addition, they've calculated and looked at 3 additional areas, which are those, quote, recovery costs, and those are activities and efforts and resources that relate to bringing the organization, your network, your critical environment, your system, back to a state of acceptable readiness. Then the ex post response, that's after the fact incidental costs that may continue to contribute to the cost to your organization following a disruption. And there's also equipment cost. Did you have to purchase new equipment? Did you have to do repairs? Did you have to have equipment refurbished and reconditioned? Then they looked at 3 additional areas, amongst others, which is the impact on IT and the productivity within the technical staff. So lost time, resource, and expenses, having your IT personnel either idled or not working at the expected productivity levels. Then your end user community, the people that are accessing your customer, their expense and time and frustration associated with not having expected access levels. Then there's also third-party cost. Did you have to call in and get some help, whether it's contractors or vendors or suppliers or specialists or auditors that get engaged to help you resolve that unplanned outage? Okay. In addition, taking a look at that study, did you have hard losses? Was it revenue losses from customers or potential customers because they were not able to use your system? And then there's business disruption and the consequences. And that's the potential economic loss of the outage. And this is painted in broad strokes in the Ponyman study. So whether it's reputation or image or customer dissatisfaction, or some churn and turnover, or lost business opportunities. This particular graphic kind of brings in, on the left-hand side, they call it an activity-based costing model. And on the left-hand side, some of those activities we talked about: detecting, containment, recovery, and then after the event, or ex-post response. And down below you will see there's actual direct hard costs, and then indirect cost, which is tying into resource availability, tying into lost opportunity, and also it's really time and efforts and other organizational resources that are spent, but it may not have a direct financial cash flow impact, an opportunity cost. Then as you see on the right-hand side in the study, what are the consequences as they affect your equipment and IT productivity, user community, third parties, lost revenue, and business disruptions from the previous slides. So we have a quick poll here. Again, Tiffany, I'll turn it to you quickly.
So we have, which of the following do you think is the most costly as a result of an unplanned outage? Direct costs, indirect costs, opportunity costs. And the votes are coming in. Okay, we're going to close it out here.
Thank you, Tiffany. And I see it's kind of locked 50-50. Indirect cost, time and effort, how do we count that? And opportunity cost. So clearly we have some folks that have been familiar and down the trail with disruptions in critical environments. So we thank you for your thoughts and ideas here. Okay. So according to the study, and they've got this color-coded as I mentioned earlier, these are 3 distinct studies done at scheduled intervals over time, where the blue was 2010 as a baseline, the center kind of that, I'm not really good on colors, kind of that reddish rust thing was 2013, and the more green is the study completed last year. So the indirect cost pretty much fall in line as the highest category, and it's pretty close to what you guys had guessed at on your poll. So the business disruption, and they've done a couple of different ways of saying what are the biggest ticket items. So business disruption represents the most expensive categories. And again, we have the 3 colors with the legend down below, where the blue was 2010 baseline, and then 2013 in that rust, and kind of the green for 2016. So business disruption, and these are in thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you see, in business disruption, just over the period of this study, 3 different studies, the original findings, it was probably $180,000 per event. And of course, there's huge variables, which industry, how long was the event, what was the duration, and how extended and complex. But you see those numbers have gone from around $180,000 in business disruption and over $250,000 per event. All of those numbers have kind of escalated, and you see the greens generally kind of lead, which really supports what we already know. We are heavier users of technology, and we have higher expectations of availability. This slide is interesting. It's always amazed me a little bit. Okay. in a critical environment, problems, the biggest problem and common failure is uninterruptible power systems. When this study was originally commissioned and supported and paid for, it was from a UPS manufacturer. So coming out of this system failure, I'm not sure quite how they felt that the product and service that they supply did not really meet the objective of the definition of a UPS, uninterruptible power system. And we do see over time that rate has come down a little bit. And currently, if you look on the right-hand side, when you get into cyber crime category, intrusion detection, malware, hostaging, the whole categories that we're seeing, denial of service attack, it's really jumped up and ahead of human error for the first time. Then the average cost, in addition, let's just go back and I'll make one more comment on that UPS. This does not mean your UPS is flawed. This does not mean it's unreliable. In most cases, it means because you have not done the proper maintenance and understood or done the investment over time or done the training. So it isn't the engineering side of putting in a UPS and sizing it. It's how it is operated and maintained or not operated and maintained. On this slide, we're also looking over time. So you have IT equipment failure also results in a high cost. That might be where it's a failure of a drive or a component or a storage device or something in your network. And a lot of that leads to having redundancy and high availability or the lack thereof. So in an ideal world, in a critical environment, if you're designing it for high availability, one component or piece of equipment should not cause a major failure. And as you see, again, as expected, the intentional or deliberate cybercrime is right up there also. Interesting enough, and we've mentioned, weather events that are happening. Traditionally, this is often overlooked. The severe weathers, the big weather events, the things that get covered in the media, they do get covered in the media. However, they're not the major contributing cause. So we've got some information. We've talked about some history. We've kicked around a few ideas. And we've looked at an example of here is a data center location. So what can you do about it? You've inherited, in many cases, your facility. Somebody else has designed and built it. They may have moved on and are no longer with the organization, or they may have been promoted and they're your boss. I didn't say it was your fault as either a facilities person or an IT or an operator in between where you're expected to keep a high availability and minimize disruption. I didn't say it was your fault. In many cases, and you see this, I said I was going to blame you. That is an event I've seen repeat itself in multiple cultures. When a problem occurs, we're looking for a victim. We're looking for somebody to blame. And there's often that effort and research that goes on for days and weeks following an event. And many times it's flawed. You might have a staff member or a person who has been operating the system for an extended period of time with no problems and has never made a mistake and then made one whoopsie. And then we're going to blame that as a victim. So there's a whole lot of things that you need to think about. I would first tell you as tactical and operations folks that are inherited a data center or critical environment, there's a need to create a roadmap towards resilience or to manage risk over time. Or you can choose to just react with your pants on fire and continue to respond to events as they occur. Since a critical environment is an organizational investment, maybe you need to approach that as an organizational asset versus a departmental or a divisional or a functional unit asset. That being said, if you decide that you need to upgrade and make major capital investments on your existing facilities, that's going to take some time and money in capital investments and budget approval. You're going to be asking up the chain of command for that approval anyways. It is not something that you can put together tactically or operationally in a short term. So part of that is up the chain of command with your bosses. Maybe you engage top management and say, this is a critical environment and it is used by not only our internal resource, but the larger user community outside, and it affects the supply chain and potentially our community. So we need to engage top management, take some ownership, and understand. This is perfect because top managers and executives understand risk. So if you approach it as a risk-based approach, they're really more likely to understand and engage intuitively than if you start talking about the specifics or the outages of high availability. If you do have some kind of steering committee or a governance structure or oversight, whatever you may call it, and engage the business. They're going to complain and be frustrated on the if it's unavailable to their use. So some of this is basic fundamental business continuity, business impact, and risk assessments. So maybe you revisit and ask yourself, when is the last time that you updated your BIA or your risk assessment or your all hazards? And if it's getting to be more than 6 months or a year, maybe you want to take a new look at that and revisit it. And then maybe an assessment, how well was that done? Was it just tick the box and go through the motions, or there's some good productive analysis completed on that? If you can use a standards-based approach or a best practice-based approach, there are a number of those out there, whether they're developed at the top level by the International Standards Organization, such as ISO, and there's a number of standards there, whether it's data security, whether it is business continuity, whether it's risk management, or whether it's cybersecurity or high availability. Or you can use national standards or industry guides such as TIA 942, or you might use NIST 800, just to name a few of those. So a standard-based approach gets you some benefit as an organization that it's sustainable, repeatable, reviewable, and measurable over time. Now when you drive down to a level, earlier in the research, and we're highlighting on this a little bit today, if we have some people-based problems, kind of looking maybe you need to develop a multi-year strategy or a roadmap, whatever you want to call it, whatever works in your organization versus reaction. Maybe you look on the left-hand side of your screen and assess the current state. How do you find people, bring them on board, and keep them, especially in the critical environment? And how do you train them? Do you use training like this is the way it's always been done around here? And an existing staff member trains them from the best that they've figured out over time? Take a look at your staffing capacity. There's a whole lot of research out there, and you can bring in your risk managers and your human resource folks, etc. If you're constantly having people work overtime or being on call or having to respond to events, their efficiency goes down, their happiness at work goes down, your ability to retain them can be impacted, and their selection and logic can be impacted. If there's a problem and you're assigning people to things, are they assigned or volunteered or voluntold? And we also work, just the last item there, we work in silos. It's the nature of the beast in a critical environment. There's specialty skill sets, whether you are directly tied to storage, or whether you're a network specialist or a DBA, a database administrator, or a sysadmin, many of our systems, including legacy, are so complex you need to have subject matter expertise and abilities there. So how do you train? Then on the right-hand side, desired state, it's pretty logical, and you know this, but you need to have the organization engage and talk to you. It's much more financially effective to keep your desired and critical staff than constantly be replacing and churning. Part of that keeping competent staff is to develop competence through training. And we'll give you a few ideas on that. So then the benefit of that, your training, your professional development, and your skills and your availability to keep people current with not only what's happening in your current environment, but what's happening out in the industry and how fast technology is moving. That investment is very low when you compare it to the cost of any kind of problem or outage and the likelihood of that. And a desired state would be that staffing balance over time. So I don't know how many organizations, very high, roughly probably in the 80% range that I see consulting and training or auditing, their staff is overworked and they don't have enough resources, and there's key resources, and there's generally a core team of a handful of people that keep the lights run and things running. So on the left-hand side, when we talk about assigned or voluntold, maybe a more proactive and desired state would be, are the people asked to do some kind of role, are they fit for purpose? Are they the right people? Are they fit for duty? If you call them on off hours in between, are they ready to work, or are they enjoying the social time? Are they willing and able? Are they cross-trained? And do you have sufficient documentation and templates for them? Which leads into the next slide. You need to develop a roadmap and a multi-year strategy in your documentation. So on the left-hand side, it's worthwhile, if you have not done it, to take a review and say, what do you have in place? Is it really usable? Is it timely and effective? Have you done an independent review? Have you had a knowledgeable third party, whether it's external or maybe an internal auditor that's competent? Take a look at your standard operating procedures and your emergency operating procedures. And when you're doing change control, change management, or CABs or change advisory boards, whatever you call them, how is that involved and as a representative of all the stakeholders we talked about easier, or is that a subset? And how current is your inventory and your capacity planning so you're able, or are you not able to expend some resources? So a desired state is make sure your procedures are in place so your people are able to do their job appropriately, and that ties back to the people issues. And that helps you with your cross-training and your depth charts, and help people to at least fail forward if they are not the expert in that event. And these procedures are best used if you write them and forget them. They need to be used, and you need to be able to report and provide metrics of how they're used in various exercises and drills and testing and upgrades, any kind of run book or DR stuff that you do. And your procedures should support and demonstrate compliance. Most technicians that I run into are not comfortable or great at documentation. So you may want to look at getting a technical writer to help you with this. Now let's talk specifically about the IT folks and the technical operations. And most likely you're no different than any other organization. You have end-of-life concerns. And maybe they're being addressed, or maybe you have a budget request in, or you're justifying, or it's been denied in many cases because of lack of understanding. So are you at end of life, where it's no longer supported, whether it's hardware, software, or licensing? Maybe you have legacy systems. Maybe you have old mainframes, or maybe you have old Sun systems or HP systems, that you're trying to move away from, and the organization has never been able to do that. And there's always an excuse because it's probably tangled up with different technologies, and there's feeder systems that run from your legacy system all the way up to your modern RACX x86 type systems. How do you manage information and data? This is getting to be huge. I gave a presentation last week on that to the FCOM chapter last week in Minneapolis, and just talking about dark data. And the definition of that dark data is like, how much information are you gathering now that that comes from social media, that comes from systems that you put in, that came in from sensors, and how much is rot? By rot is how much data and storage are you paying for, because it's always been easier when storage got cheap to buy more storage than to spring clean. So you get a rot situation. What's redundant, what's obsolete, what's trivial storage? Then going along with that technical issues, it's great to get your data replicated and off-site. But having your data and how you're doing it and with mixed platforms and technologies and vendors, then how do your specific applications access and run that at either an alternate site that you have, or if you go more of a disaster as a DR as a service, or a traditional recovery facility. So having the data, but can you use it in a timely basis and meet those expectations from your customers? So basically in saying backups are fine. Can you restore them? And is it usable? If there's been some kind of cyber crime occurring and you've had something in your system for multiple backup versions, that could be a challenge in between, because now you got to find it and try and resolve it. So the best way is to demonstrate through whatever testing capability and exercise that you can meet the availability requirements which vary from your organization. So developing a roadmap to do that over time is not a simple solution, and it's going to cost time and money and required some investment and resources from the organization. The same for the supporting infrastructure. And I'm going to differentiate the previous screen for more your IT geek, and this side is more of your facility or your engineering people, your electricians, your mechanic, your maintenance guys. How are they doing? Are they able to do their predictive and preventative maintenance in an effective manner as prescribed by vendors and compliance and standards and best practices? Are they managing spares, critical spares that need to replace? It could be as simple as a breaker, or it could be as complex as a transformer or an elevator. And what kind of change control do you have in place? A pattern I see pretty frequently is if you have change control, it's limited to the IT side of the house, and it does not engage the impacts on the facilities or the infrastructure support side of the house. And if you do capacity planning on the IT side, is that linked up and coordinated with your infrastructure side, your electricians, your mechanics, your capacity, your life safety that we looked about? So all that supporting system in the third and fourth bullets here is, are you protecting your electrical power systems? We recognize from the research that UPS systems can be a major cause of a problem if they are not properly designed, updated, and tested and maintained by competent people. So that's a known issue. And if you shared some of these ideas and research up the chain of command, and understand some of the challenges that you are facing. And the same goes for in a critical environment. You need to power things, you need to cool them, you need to make sure that they're protective and secure, and doing proper housekeeping. So part of that effort, your facilities, your engineers, your tradesmen, they need to do protection and evaluation and testing, not only at the system level, but at the device and the component level. If you're not using computational fluid dynamics, that is great technology that gives you some idea of the loads and capability and alternatives that you can look at. So I'd highly recommend you take a look at computational fluid dynamics. Okay. Then there's policy and procedures. We talked about documents and standard operating in between. Review those. It's nice to have procedures, but they need to be defined, and you need to educate your people, and they need to be enforced. There needs to be some consequences. That includes some basic, there should never be an emergency delivery, whether it's a server, a hub, a MUX, a router, or a breaker. You should keep appropriate spares close to be able to meet your availability requirements. Nothing should ever be unpacked in a critical environment or around it, specifically a data center. It is a critical environment, so again, no food, drink, or people in there if possible. If the people need to come in to perform, get them in, get them out. Okay, it's an equipment room. Okay. Avoid rushing. We're always under pressure to get things done. That's when we make mistakes. Timely and cautious. If you're going to use vendors and contractors and specialists and suppliers, make sure that you have good selection and checking your supply chain and specifications before and after work and ongoing. Then there's some basic things. There's in different cultures around the world, no one would dream of walking into a guest house with their shoes. They take them off at the entrance. If you're in the West, and the Americas are pretty guilty about this, you walk through the parking lot and pick up all that detritus, and you walk into the office building or the complex and you walk right up into the data center. So you're bringing all that mess and possible detritus in with you. Walk-off mats are good, and they're basic, and they're cheap to put in place. And then there's most likely around most critical environments some kind of anti-static procedures, whether that's the little wristbands or whether you're able to touch a discharge plate at the entry to the door. Find those out and use them. Those are low cost effective. Make sure that they're enforced. Okay. I'm looking at the time. So I wanted to share a couple of different ideas and also leave a little bit of time to take a few questions. But I want to touch on this summary and a few examples. First, we want to take a kind of a high-level quick look of potential risks specific to the critical environment. At a high level, we looked at some of those and looked at some research, and that's really the first step to understanding how to manage those risks and address those risks. If you are not a risk expert, there's other people in your organizations that maybe you can engage in this. Maybe there's the enterprise risk department. Maybe you engage the business continuity or ITDR people if they're available. Maybe you engage internal audit or a quality assurance program and get some input from them because they have the same shared vision, which is high availability and protecting the organization assets. In addition, take advantage of studies that are done. Do some research, get some training, get your people educated, use sources like I-Corps and others in between, and identify what studies and what is prevalent out there, and look at it appropriately, and then be able to balance short-term versus long-term. For example, the very loose example I used, if you inherited a data center, it's probably not likely that you're going to get approved to build a brand new data center, a critical environment, or a server room and have it in place by Labor Day. It's a big high-ticket item, complex, it's an investment that requires proper planning. But if you're taking advantage of some research and study and see what's going out there from every available research, that can help you to understand and learn how to manage risk as an organization. And the reason I use risk is that, again, is a language that is commonly understood and engaged and endorsed and by your top management. And understanding that there's different causes of outages, and you're probably aware of those events. You probably have a history that you looked at into your own organization where you've had a little bit of an event or a near miss, or you've had a disruption, whether it was a planned outage, maybe to upgrade, do some service that you had a window of time to do an upgrade and you exceeded that window of time, or an unplanned outage where something occurred as a whoopsie. So understanding the different causes and potential contributing factors to those outages and risk. And if we begin with the people, and here's a common sense when you talk to your executives. Almost every organization I've been in the last 3 decades normally has a statement that your people are your most important asset. So this is an accountability. If your most important asset, it makes logical sense then investing to develop professionally the competence and protect and retain these assets. And the other thing I frequently see, if it's not your employee, the other thing is our company's most important asset is our customers or our clients. And there'll be a statement such as, without our customers, we wouldn't have a reason for being here. So if you're servicing your customers in between, it also ties into the logic of the belief and culture that your organization has in place. So those aren't empty words. That's a culture. It's a statement. It's written. It's a mission statement. Maybe bring to light how your critical environment ties in and supports that. And it's been increasing over time. So just a touch, I see some people that are attending that have taken various courses or participated or been involved. Thank you. This is some of our technical infrastructure and facility management courses that range up from essential knowledge, the 1000 course, what do you need to know for running a critical environment? And that's a 2-day instructor-led. Then there's the TIFM 2000 and 3000 series. Those are the same content, and take a look at the website and look at it. The difference being, are they an e-learning at your own pace, or are they traditional instructor-led? The same with the 4 or 5000, where the 2 and 3 deals with the technician, the 4 and 5 deals with the manager. They have different roles and responsibilities, and again, these are offered e-learning in 3-day. And then the 6000 is, what is the role of the engineer that is designing and making sure that all of the critical environment operates as intended. And if really a lot of folks, if you're going to have to do risk and assess it, you might want to take a look at the 7000, which is being able to audit your critical environment. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about future opportunities and coming events in the webinar series from I-Corps.
So Jim, you actually have 2 questions here. If this is a good time, you want to go over those questions?
Perfect.
Okay, the first one is, what is the contaminant brought into the data center? Walk off from mats?
Yeah, that could be anything from anything that's out in the parking lot or the street or your car, wherever your shoes are. And really, when you want to look at a critical environment, it should be like a hospital operating room. It should be protected at that level. So dirt is bad. Contaminants are bad. Foreign products are bad, whether it's when you bring it into that critical environment, that's normally still, in most cases, cooled through air conditioning. So you're moving air throughout the environment through your big crack units. If you have raised floor, it's pressurized underneath the floor. If you don't have raised floor, it's still being pushed throughout the environment. So proper house cleaning. Any dirt or maintenance or any activities or foreign substances you bring in are going to be pushed right through your servers as they're picked up through the air. So there's always dust and contaminants. That's why you have filters in between. So make sure you don't add to those dust and contaminants. And it could be as simple as small little bits and particles of metal that can contribute to short circuits. Good. Hopefully that answered. Do you have another one, Tiffany?
Yes, the next one is earlier it was mentioned that 80% of failures were human error with 70% from admin errors. Later, UPS failures were attributed to most failures. Is there a correlation between the two?
One more time. I missed the two categories, and I'll go back.
Sure. 80% of failures were human error.
Yep.
And 70% were from admin errors.
Admin is just a general category here that I put in based upon a whole bunch of research. Let me go back here. And the administrative errors really talked about how you run your facility and the budget and what you're allowed to do. So I'm going back to this slide. Do you have procedures? Are they enforced? Do you not have procedures? Are you trained to those? Do you have old legacy systems you've never been able to retire? Do you not get funding? All of those are directly tied to human error. If your documentation is flawed or doesn't exist, people will try and figure it out and maybe not do the best with that. If they're not trained to that because you don't have the time and capabilities and the commitment from the organization, they're going to make mistakes. So documentation is, as I've been saying for several years, isn't the sexiest thing to do around IT and most glamorous. And it is not a strength. So if you have documentation and you train your people on why you're doing that and get their expertise, you should be able to drive down the administrative and human cost, risk, and errors. I hope that answered your question. Any others, Tiffany?
Let's see here. I do want to address, there was a question about the audio recording. This is being recorded, so it will be available on the website. Let's see here. And I guess this is a follow-up to the human error and admin error correlation. Yes, in another slide it was identified that outages were caused by UPS failure. So,
yes, and in most cases, when you read the studies and you look at that, the UPS failures were because, number one, you didn't keep current with the UPS and meet the manufacturer's requirements and do your testing and updates, and you didn't have competent people and procedures. It isn't the UPS itself, the way it's engineered. It's how it's operationalized and serviced by your team and people. So they tie together. It's easier and more cost-effective to get some competent people and trained and selected than replace the entire backup electrical system in your critical environment. So that's some low-hanging fruit and tactical capabilities that you can take on. And then you can report on those metrics and show some examples if you need to report up the chain of command and say, here's some simple things that we've done over the course of the last weeks, months, quarters, and years to address our competence. Good. And looking at the time, we're right up against it. Again, taking you to future webinars, we'd love to include you. And thank you very much for participating and taking time out of your busy days. Feel free to contact us with further questions, and we'll do our best efforts to support your needs. Thank you on behalf of myself, Tiffany, and ICOR. We are done today.